He was a blind musician with more awards than most artists could dream of. To his friends, he was the genius of soul. To the world, he was a legend. And at one point, according to countless reports, he was also known as a heroin addict who, it was said, walked away from the drug cold turkey and never looked back for the last 17 years of his life. But in the summer of 2004, inside a quiet room in Beverly Hills, all of that, the Grammys, the fame, the headlines, faded into the background. The lights were low, the machines hummed in a steady whisper, oxygen hissed in fits and starts, and family members stood around the bed of Ray Charles Robinson, frozen in place as his breathing turned shallow. He had outlived poverty. He had endured racism. He had survived blindness, addiction, and heartbreak. Yet, as his lungs strained and his pulse weakened, those who stood closest to him later said they heard something in his fading voice they had never heard before. It was not just weakness, it was fear. A deep, unmistakable terror. He did not speak about contracts, or record labels, or who had wronged him in the industry. He did not talk about money, or fame, or the dark years of heroin. Instead, the words that slipped out were tied to something much older, something he had kept buried since childhood. A memory that, according to people who knew him best, had shaped every tour, every song, every triumph, and every collapse. In that dim room, as the walls seemed to draw closer and the sound of the machines grew distant, his family began to understand why Ray Charles had never truly talked about this part of his past. This was the one truth he feared more than death itself. A truth anchored to a single afternoon, to a basin of water, and to a life he believed he had ruined long before the world ever clapped for him. Chapter 1. The Origin of the Secret. 1948. 1955. The story of Ray Charles's terrible secret does not begin in a studio booth drenched in reverb, or on a tour bus rolling through the night, or backstage under neon signs and cigarette haze. It begins years earlier, before the record deals, before the spotlight, before the name Ray Charles meant anything to anyone. It starts on a heavy, humid day in 1,948 inches, Greenville, Florida, a small, dust-choked town where the heat seemed to hang in the air and time itself moved slowly. The Charles family's wooden shack sat in that heat, its backyard framed by worn boards and hard-packed earth. The smell of pine, rusted metal, and damp wood clung to everything. On that afternoon, 7-year-old Ray Charles Robinson stood in the doorway of the house, half in shadow, half in sunlight, listening. Outside, in the backyard, water sloshed quietly in a wooden washtub. His little brother, George, played nearby, laughing in the bright Florida sun with the kind of wild, weightless joy only a child that young can manage. The light was harsh, almost painful. Ray's eyes were already failing, already clouded by the glaucoma that had begun stealing his sight. Shapes blurred, edges softened, faces became outlines instead of details. He squinted at the scene before him, trying to hold on to what little clarity he had left. He saw George leaning over the tub, small hands reaching toward something floating on the water's surface. He caught the glint of wet wood, the shine of the basin, the silhouette of his brother shifting forward. In that split second, Ray saw George's foot slip on the soaked boards. He saw the little body pitch toward the tub. And in that frozen moment between balance and disaster, Ray tried to move. His hands shot out, his legs stumbled forward, his throat tightened as he tried to shout. According to stories he shared much later, the scream never fully formed. There was only a choked sound, air without words. Then the splash. Water exploded upward and then fell silent. The laughter stopped. The backyard, a second earlier alive with the sound of a child at play, went completely still. People would later insist it was an accident, a tragic misstep, a moment no one could have predicted or prevented. Adults would say no one was to blame. Neighbors would call it a heartbreaking twist of fate. But Ray never embraced that version of the story. The memory that lived in his mind was harsher. He remembered standing only a few steps away. He remembered the blur of his brother's shirt vanishing into the water. He remembered the cold rush of panic as he grabbed, scrambled, and failed to pull George up in time. And he remembered the moment his mother found them, One son soaked and shaking, the other already unnaturally still. In the weeks that followed, Ray spoke less and less. He ate in silence. Sleep came in small, broken fragments. He did not talk about what had happened, but what had happened never stopped talking to him. It slipped into his dreams, the splash, then the stillness, then the unbearable quiet. As the year drew to a close, something even worse began. Ray's vision, already deteriorating, started to fail faster than doctors expected. Shapes turned into shadows. Shadows dissolved into fog. Colors drained into a dull, formless gray. By the end of 1948, the last light went out. Ray stepped into complete darkness. Most children scream when the world disappears. They grab for furniture, for hands, for anything that reassures them reality is still there. But family members would later recall that Ray did not respond that way. He did not rage. He did not beg. He simply went still, as if he had been expecting this all along, as if he believed this was the price. At home, they noticed how quiet he had become. At night, he often sat alone, hands clasped tightly together, head bowed, his breath shallow and uneven. Sometimes his mother would enter the room and find him facing the wall, lips trembling, his unseeing eyes fixed on a point only he could feel. He moved through the house like someone awaiting a verdict. By early 1949, Ray began waking in the middle of the night drenched in sweat. Years later, he reportedly told close friends that he sometimes felt a presence behind him in the dark. Small, light, like a child's shadow hovering just out of reach. He could not see it, but he felt it following him from room to room, down hallways, across strange floors. In the early hours before sunrise, when the house was utterly silent, he occasionally heard it. The faint, impossible splash of water where no water should be. He never told his mother. He never told his teachers at the street. Augustine School for the Deaf and the Blind. But it traveled with him, from bed to classroom, from childhood to the edge of adulthood. The town, meanwhile, whispered in its own cruel language. Children muttered that George had died because Ray hadn't shouted loud enough. Some adults suggested, in hushed voices, that their mother should have been watching more closely. Others simply shook their heads and called it one of those things. Ray, however, accepted only one version of the story, his own. In his mind, he had failed. The blindness, he believed, was punishment. And according to people who were close to him later in life, he would sometimes admit that he felt as if the accident in that backyard had reached out and touched him again, stealing the last of his sight as a sentence. Between 1950 and 1955. As Ray discovered music with fierce intensity, mastering the piano and learning to navigate a world where sound replaced light, the memory of George changed. It was no longer just a moment sealed in the past. It became a presence, a companion, a ghost that followed him from state to state as he played in cramped bars and smoky clubs across the South. Even in crowded rooms filled with laughter, clinking glasses, the rustle of dresses, and the low murmur of voices, Ray carried a quiet storm just beneath his ribs. He tried to drown it in rhythm, in rehearsals that stretched past midnight, in constant motion. The more he moved, the less he had to think. But water gave him away. Every time he washed his face, bathed, or felt heavy humidity settle on his skin, the memory returned the icy echo of that wooden basin in 1948. Some nights, while traveling through Georgia or Louisiana on aging buses that rattled over back roads, he would sit awake as dawn crept in, hands shaking, unable to name the dread bearing down on his chest. Bandmates assumed he was homesick. They did not know that, in his mind, he was still standing beside a washtub that would not let him go. By 1955, long before the heroin, long before the Grammys, long before the world tours, Ray Charles was already a man carrying a lifetime of guilt. According to those who heard fragments of his story years later, he had never truly shared the full truth with anyone. What he held on to was simple and brutal. He believed he had stood in the sunlight, inches from his little brother, and watched death take him. And no matter how many songs he wrote, no matter how many stages he conquered, he could not quiet the belief that the world had punished him in the only way it knew how. When Ray finally stepped onto the national stage, the public saw a genius. They saw the dark glasses, the wide grin, the fingers flying over the keys. What they did not see, what they never could have seen, was the 7-year-old boy on his knees beside a silent washtub, desperately trying to convince himself he hadn't caused the one thing he feared most. Behind every spotlight that ever touched Ray Charles, that ghost was still there, just out of frame, waiting. Chapter 2. The Addiction Years. 1955. 1965. If George's drowning marked the birth of Ray Charles's secret, then the decade that followed 1955 to 1965 was the period when that secret finally grew teeth. By then, Ray was no longer the thin, frightened boy who recoiled at the sound of water hitting metal. He was becoming a force in American music. His voice was turning into the sound of Southern soul. His piano style was unmistakable, rough and holy at the same time, and his name began to travel from one smoky club to another like a rumor that refused to die. From New Orleans to Atlanta, Chicago to Street Louie, people were starting to talk about him in serious terms. Promoters wanted him. Radio stations spun his records. He was no longer just another musician trying to survive. He was becoming someone the country would soon be unable to ignore. But beneath the applause, another timeline ran parallel, darker, quieter, and far more dangerous. The shift came in the spring of 1955 during a tour stop in Houston. Ray had been worn down by nights of brutal insomnia, hands shaking, soaked in sweat, woken by the same recurring nightmare. George leaning over the basin, slipping, falling, disappearing. After one performance, behind the curtain with his nerves frayed and his body trembling, a bandmate offered him something to take the edge off. It would help him sleep, they said. It would calm him down. That night, for the first time, heroin entered Ray Charles's bloodstream. Witnesses later described how the drug wrapped around him like a warm blanket, the edges of his fear blurred. The splash, the water, the image of his brother sinking, they all receded, smothered under the narcotic haze. It wasn't joy, it wasn't happiness, but it was quiet. For someone who had been haunted for years, that quiet was enough to hook him. From 1956 on, heroin became the silent companion on nearly every tour. Newspapers praised Ray as a genius reinventing American music, a man who bent gospel, blues, and R&B into something new. But backstage, in the cramped dressing rooms and anonymous hallways of theaters across the country, a different Ray emerged. Stagehands saw the version who sometimes collapsed in private, who gripped tables until his knuckles turned white, whose hands trembled so badly before a show that he needed a moment just to steady them. Musicians watched him vanish for long stretches when the pressure in his chest became unbearable. Guilt and addiction slowly wrapped around each other until they were impossible to separate. The tour managers noticed first. On the 29th of August 1956, at Chicago's Club de Lisa, Ray abruptly stopped in the middle of soundcheck. He leaned onto the piano and stayed there, motionless, for nearly 10 minutes, breathing like someone who had just come up from deep water. The band thought he was ill, but according to people who heard about that night later, Ray wasn't reacting to sickness, he was reacting to something only he could feel. In his mind, the wooden washtub from 1948 had reappeared, more vivid than it had ever been since he lost his sight. He could feel the cold water climbing around his legs. The stage was dry, but his body reacted as though he were drowning. The audience that night never knew why the show started 37 minutes late. They never knew that behind the curtain, a man who looked invincible in the spotlight was battling a memory he could not escape. By 1957, the visions, or what those around him later described as hallucinations, returned more often. They started the same way every time. The room seemed to tighten around him, the temperature dropped. Somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, there was the faint drip of water that did not exist. Sometimes it happened while he was combing his hair, holding a brush above a hotel sink. Sometimes it hit in the cramped space where he changed his suits before a show. Sometimes it struck during interviews, mid-sentence, when he would go eerily still for several seconds, as though sucked backwards into a place no one else in the room could see. Each time the visions rose up, heroin stepped forward with its promise of relief. Ray took the bargain again and again. The drug didn't erase the past, but it blurred it just enough for him to keep moving. Outwardly, however, he soared. The late 1,950 seconds gave the world I Got a Woman, What I Say, and a string of tours that drove crowds into a frenzy. Gospel-rooted soul kept evolving under his hands. His record spread across the country like wildfire. To the public, Ray Charles had never looked more powerful. Inside, he was shrinking. Each success seemed to carry the same cold whisper pressed into the back of his mind. You don't deserve this. You owe a life. In the winter of 1958, during a period of heavy touring, Ray met a young backup singer who joined the band on the road for a few months. Years later, she would describe moments that left her deeply unsettled. She recalled Ray jolting awake in anonymous motel rooms, gasping for air, as though someone right next to him were being pulled under. She remembered him sitting alone in the dark, his voice barely audible as he murmured apologies to no one she could see. She described him gripping the sink so tightly his hands shook, as if trying to anchor himself against a wave only he could feel. One night in Memphis, she walked into the bathroom and stopped cold. The tub was half full of water. Ray stood beside it, trembling. He had avoided bathtubs for years, preferring quick showers or anything that didn't involve still water. Yet something had drawn him there that night, something old, something he still refused to name. Then came 1961, a year that would peel back the thin layer of control he had left. During a long stretch of touring through the Midwest, Ray confided to a trusted associate that he felt pursued not by police, not by journalists, but by the ghost of his own past. His heroin use increased sharply. Crew members began to worry. Promoters started whispering about missed rehearsals, sudden schedule changes, and behavior that bordered on the erratic. But to fans, nothing looked wrong. Ray always made it to the stage. He always played. He always delivered a performance that looked like complete control. The spiral broke into full view in November 1961 during a show in Indianapolis. Mid-song, Ray's fingers froze above the keys. The crowd assumed he was stretching out an improvisational pause, a dramatic choice by a master performer. Backstage, the band saw the truth. Ray was silently struggling for air, chest heaving, lips parted, as if an invisible hand had pulled him beneath the surface of a river. They rushed toward him, but he insisted on finishing the set. He played the final 10 minutes soaked in sweat, hands shaking violently, forcing himself to grip the piano bench just to stay steady. On the outside, it looked like passion. On the inside, it was survival. By 1963, the pressure from within and without reached its breaking point. Ray began missing flights. He once disappeared for almost 6 hours in a Cleveland hotel before a show, locking himself in the bathroom with the faucet running the entire time. Those close to him believed he was trying to prove he could stand the sound of running water and not fall apart. When he finally emerged and walked to the stage, he looked composed. But crew members who brushed against him said his hands felt like ice. Then, in the fall of 1964, the secret stopped being invisible and stepped into the public record. On the 23rd of October 1964, Ray Charles was arrested at Boston's Logan Airport on a narcotics charge involving heroin. Headlines exploded across the country. Ray Charles on narcotics charge. Fans were stunned. Some refused to believe it. Others said they had seen it coming. Friends were devastated, but a few quietly admitted that the arrest had accomplished something no one else had been able to do. It had forced Ray to come face to face with the ghost he had been dodging for 16 years. During rehab in 1965, staff members reportedly noticed something peculiar about his reactions. Any time he heard a bathtub filling or a sink running, his entire body stiffened, his pulse spiked. He looked, in the words of one observer, physically haunted. Counselors tried to tie his reactions to childhood trauma, gently asking about his early years. Most of the time, Ray stayed silent. When he did talk, it was rarely about prison, or shame, or the risk to his career. He talked about water. He talked about drowning. He talked about a hot afternoon in 1,948 inches, a small backyard in Florida that he could not and would not forget. In those sessions, one pattern became painfully clear. Ray did not just blame himself for the addiction, he blamed himself for nearly everything. The blindness, the drugs, the guilt, the spirals. It was as if the entire decade from 1955 to 1965 had been, in his mind, one long sentence carried out for the death of a little boy who never got a chance to grow up. This was not just addiction, it was atonement. For 10 years, Ray Charles tried every escape route he could find: music, touring, heroin, denial from a single truth he believed he could never erase. Chapter 3. The Confessions Nobody Heard. 1970. 1990. By the time the 1,970 seconds rolled in, Ray Charles had become larger than the life he was actually living. The crowds were louder, the stages bigger, the checks fatter, and the spotlight harsher than ever. His name was stitched into the fabric of American music. But none of that silenced the secret he had carried since 1948. If anything, the more famous he became, the closer the memory seemed to move. Success stripped away the distractions he once used as armor. The secret he tried to bury beneath records, tours, and late-night sessions didn't disappear. It simply pressed harder against the surface, as if every standing ovation pulled the ghost of his brother that much nearer. Eventually, the secret started to leak into the open, not through public interviews or dramatic confessions, but through breakdowns no one could fully explain, through relationships that unraveled without clear reasons, through quiet tremors he could no longer fully hide. The first major crack appeared in the studio. In early 1972, inside RCA Studio B in Los Angeles, Ray was at work on a project producers believed could become another landmark moment in his career. The room carried the familiar atmosphere of confidence: warm tube amps, carefully placed microphones, seasoned musicians who knew they were backing a legend. In the middle of an almost flawless take, with the horns rising like a wave behind him, Ray suddenly stopped. His fingers slipped off the piano keys, as if they no longer belonged to him. His breathing shortened. His shoulders folded inward. For a few seconds, he looked less like an icon and more like a frightened child, flinching before something no one else in the room could sense. From behind the glass, the engineer watched as Ray quietly broke down. The band fell silent one by one, instruments hanging in the air. Tears streamed down Ray's face in slow, trembling lines. No one moved. No one dared to step inside the booth. When the room had finally gone completely quiet, Ray whispered something the engineer would remember for the rest of his life. It wasn't a full confession. It wasn't even a coherent story. It was only a fragment, a broken sentence about having hurt someone long before music made him famous. No names, no place, no date. Just enough to hint that the guilt he carried had roots reaching back far beyond the stage. If the studio revealed the cracks, his love life showed the collapse. Throughout the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, Ray Charles was never short of affection. He traveled, he performed, he attracted admirers. But again and again, those relationships broke under the pressure of something invisible, something he would not name. According to stories told by several women later, the pattern was almost always the same. Emotional intimacy followed by sudden cold distance, warmth followed by nights of terror, promises followed by unexplained fear. In 1973, while touring through Dallas, a young singer traveling with the band noticed Ray waking in motel rooms with a start, gasping for air, fingers clawing into the sheets. She said it seemed as though he were trying to grab hold of someone slipping away, someone small and fragile, just out of reach. She recalled nights when he sat in the dark, motionless, breathing unevenly. He would reach out into empty space, hands shaking, as if bracing for a fall that never came. When she asked what was wrong, he changed the subject or shut down. Eventually, she left, convinced that he was haunted by something that had nothing to do with fame or women. A few years later, around 1976, Another vocalist ended her relationship with him after an incident in a hotel bathroom near La Cienega Boulevard in Los Angeles. She reportedly walked in to find the sink overflowing, water spilling across the tile floor, and Ray standing before it, frozen, gripping the counter so hard the porcelain seemed close to cracking. She was terrified. He was shaken. He said very little afterward, and then never spoke of it again. Neither did she, but she never forgot the look on his face. By the early 1980 seconds, yet another long-term partner described scenes that fit the same disturbing pattern. According to her, Ray would stay awake for hours at night, sitting upright, staring into nothing, breathing so slowly she feared he might simply disappear into whatever memory had seized him. She recalled one particular stay in New York. Just before dawn, she found him sitting on the bathroom floor beside an empty bathtub. The tub was dry, but his posture was rigid, his head bowed, as if he were on trial before a judge no one else could see. She said she loved him deeply, but she also confessed she could not live with the sense that he was hiding a crime he had never actually committed, but believed, in his own mind, he had caused. During those same years, his public life reached extraordinary heights. From sold-out evenings at Carnegie Hall to standing ovations around the world, Ray seemed unstoppable. In 1985, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest honors in the United States. Cameras flashed, speeches were made. History was written with his name engraved on it. Yet, in quieter moments, he reportedly kept circling back to the same story, not in front of microphones, but in late-night conversations behind closed doors. Friends in his inner circle later recalled that between roughly 1,978 and 1,982, in dressing rooms after shows, Ray would occasionally fall silent, then drift into fragments of the childhood he rarely discussed. He spoke of George more than most people realized. He described the accident indirectly, calling it the day his vision truly died, even before his eyes went dark. He suggested, in language heavy with regret, that everything which followed the heroin, the breakdowns, the failed romances, were signs he was meant to suffer. Ray believed in punishment. That, according to those who listened to him in those private hours, was the foundation of how he saw his own life. Every applause, he suggested, was borrowed time. Every victory was temporary. Every time someone he cared for left, he accepted it as justice returning to collect. To the outside world, Ray Charles was a legend still climbing, a man who had beaten heroin, conquered blindness, and bent the music industry to his will. But to himself, he was still that boy beside the washtub, trapped in a moment that would not release him. He saw himself as a man forever drowning alongside his brother, a man who built an extraordinary legacy while believing, deep down, that he did not deserve to stand on the stage he owned. Over time, the difference between how the world saw him and how he saw himself widened into a chasm. On one side stood the icon, smiling, laughing, playing, accepting awards. On the other stood the haunted child, kneeling by the water, watching his brother's shirt disappear beneath the surface. And as the 1,980 seconds gave way to the 1,990 seconds, something in that internal war began to shift. The secret was not getting weaker with age, it was tightening its grip. The older he became, the less distance he had from that afternoon in 1948. He had survived addiction, survived scandal, survived the relentless churn of the music business. But he had never truly survived that one moment in his childhood. As the years moved steadily toward the final chapter of his life, the haunting did not fade. It closed in. Chapter 4. The Final Days, 2004. It began with a collapse no one around him was prepared to see. By the first days of May 2004, Ray Charles, a man who had survived heroin, racism, heartbreak, decades of touring, and the unforgiving machinery of fame, could no longer trust his own legs. His body, once animated by rhythm and adrenaline, had started to fold in on itself. His skin lost its warmth, his breathing grew shallow and uneven, and the powerful frame that had commanded stages around the world shrank into something frail, almost unrecognizable. To the outside world he was still an immortal icon, a permanent fixture in American culture. But inside his Beverly Hills home, a very different story was unfolding. Ray was dying, and the past he had managed to keep buried for more than half a century was rising back to the surface like something that had been waiting for this exact moment. The first undeniable sign appeared one warm evening around May 12. Nurses were easing him into bed, carefully lifting his weight, adjusting pillows, checking tubes. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the walls. As they lowered him down, Ray suddenly tensed. His hands shot forward, fingers splayed, as though he was bracing for a fall. It wasn't the stumble of an old man losing balance. It was sharper, more specific, in the instinctive reach of someone who believed he was about to drop into water. The room froze. His family thought it was confusion, perhaps a side effect of medication, but the tremor that ran through his fingers told a different story. To some of the people watching, it looked like something old had returned to claim its place. Within days, his condition declined further. His liver began to fail. Fluid collected in his lungs. He drifted in and out of restless sleep, trapped between consciousness and a fog of pain. Each time his eyes opened, he seemed less aware of the room he was in and more attuned to something just beyond it, as though he were looking not at the faces around his bed, but through them toward a memory that had stalked him since childhood. The haunting intensified on May 18. A nurse adjusting the sheets leaned closer and heard him murmuring a name, barely audible, as if the sound itself hurt to release. At first, she assumed it belonged to a musician, a friend, a lover, someone tied to his long career. But as she listened, the syllables sharpened into clarity. He wasn't calling for a bandmate. He wasn't calling for a manager. He was calling for his little brother, the boy who had died in 1948, the one Ray had never forgiven himself for losing. From that moment, the atmosphere inside the house shifted. The air felt heavier, slower, charged with something that made people lower their voices without quite knowing why. Family members walked more carefully, as if each footstep might snap a fragile thread. Nurses later said the room where Ray lay felt strangely cooler than the rest of the home, as if some invisible window had been opened. Though he couldn't see, Ray kept turning his head toward any hint of running water. A faucet turned on in a distant bathroom, a glass being rinsed in the kitchen, even the faintest echo of a pipe. No matter how soft the sound, he seemed to hear it, and his body reacted as if pulled toward it. By May 24, what little appetite he had left vanished. His breaths came in ragged, rattling pulls. His chest rose and fell just enough to suggest that life was still fighting to remain. When he spoke, it was in fragments, scattered pieces of thoughts soaked in fear and regret. Sometimes he said, "water." Sometimes he whispered about falling. Sometimes he said nothing at all, only letting the silence thicken around him, the same kind of silence that had once settled over a backyard in Florida after a single, devastating splash. The breaking point arrived on June 2, the day Ray Charles finally stopped resisting the memory he had spent his entire adult life trying to bury. The room was dim. A single lamp on a small wooden table cast a soft amber glow over the bed. Around him, family members stood in a loose circle praying, crying quietly, holding each other's hands, or simply staring at the man who had seemed untouchable for so long. The walls were lined with evidence of his legend. Framed photographs, gold and platinum records, awards, commendations, snapshots with presidents and superstars. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The Grammys, the charts, the medals, all of it faded into background noise. In Ray's mind, there was only one image left, the shadow of a small boy fighting for air in a tub of water. His breathing quickened, his fingers curled into the sheets. To those watching, it felt as if something unseen had finally stepped fully into the room. The ghost had come to collect what it believed it was owed. Then, with a surge of strength that stunned everyone present, Ray pushed himself upright. His family gasped. His blind eyes opened wide, staring into a distance none of them could see, as if he were watching that terrible afternoon replay, frame by frame. When he spoke, his voice was not the wandering, disoriented mumble of a man slipping away. It carried an eerie clarity, a sharpness that forced everyone to fall completely silent. He said he had failed someone. He said he had carried that failure alone. He said his blindness, his addiction, and the years of punishment that followed were all part of the same chain. And then, like a verdict he had been avoiding for 56 years, he spoke the words that shattered the room. He said he had let his brother die. The sentence wasn't loud, but it tore through the air. One of his daughters broke down instantly, collapsing into tears. A cousin gripped the bedpost so tightly her knuckles went pale. A son stepped back as if the words themselves had struck him. For more than half a century, Ray Charles had lived with that belief burning inside him. It was not a scandal about stolen money. It was not a secret affair or a hidden crime in the music industry. It was something far more devastating in its simplicity, a childhood tragedy he had convinced himself he caused. In the days that followed, Ray drifted further from consciousness. The boundary between past and present blurred until it was almost impossible to tell which one he was living in. Yet the image of George never left. Nurses noticed that even when his eyes were closed, his hand would sometimes lift an inch off the bed, fingers reaching into empty air as if he were once again trying to grab the arm he had missed in 1948. Then, on the 10th of June 2004, at approximately 11:35 a.m., it ended. Ray Charles exhaled one final time. The room stilled. The tension in his body released, his muscles finally relaxing after days of relentless strain. The medical equipment quieted. Outside, traffic moved. People talked on cell phones. Songs played on the radio. The world continued, largely unaware that one of its greatest musical architects had just slipped away. Inside that Beverly Hills home, however, the people gathered there understood something far more intimate than what any news headline would later say. Ray Charles did not leave this world tormented by regrets about contracts, fame, or chart positions. He did not die obsessed with business deals, royalties, or his public legacy. He died carrying the unbearable weight of a belief formed in childhood, the belief that, at 7 years old, he had stood within arm's reach of his little brother and failed to save him. And that was the terrible secret Ray Charles finally allowed into the open just before he left the world forever. Final chapter, the terrible secret revealed. When Ray Charles died late in the morning on the 10th of June 2004, the world reacted instantly. Newsrooms scrambled. Headlines called him a trailblazer, a visionary, the genius of soul who had rewritten the language of American music. Television anchors spoke his name over grainy archival footage. Fans lit candles, held vigils, and played his records on repeat, as if turning the volume up might somehow pull him back for one last performance. But inside the quiet Beverly Hills house where he took his final breath, another reality lingered, one that did not fit into sound bites or tributes, one the public never heard and the family had only just begun to understand. For 56 years, Ray Charles had lived with a ghost, not a metaphorical ghost, not a poetic image, but a memory that refused to loosen its grip. No matter how many awards he stacked on his walls, no matter how many sold-out shows he played, no matter how loudly the audience roared his name, that ghost stayed close. And now that Ray was gone, that truth, the one he had revealed in his final days, stood alone in the silence. At its core, the secret was brutally simple. Ray Charles believed he had killed his brother, not on purpose, not with intent, not through cruelty or calculated neglect. But in his mind, he had failed to save a child who slipped beneath the water just a few feet away from him. He believed that was enough to make him responsible. No police report had blamed him. No judge had ever suggested he bore any legal guilt. Neighbors did not point fingers at the 7-year-old boy standing in shock beside the tub. Even his mother, shattered by grief, never told him the words he already repeated to himself. "This is your fault." But trauma does not obey logic, and guilt does not ask permission. Ray absorbed that afternoon like a curse, a stain that sank too deep to wash out. The older he grew, the more the belief embedded itself in him. It shaped everything. He believed his blindness, which arrived months after the accident, was not just a medical condition but a sentence, a punishment written into his body. He believed the heroin that almost destroyed him in the 1,950 seconds was part of what he deserved. Pain, in his eyes, was not an unfortunate side effect of life. It was an expected companion. It echoed through failed relationships, the nights of panic, The episodes in hotel bathrooms, the trembling hands hesitating under running water as if touching the surface of a grave instead of a sink. Invisible but relentless, that belief shaped the man the world idolized. The public saw strength. Ray felt judgment. The public heard genius. Ray heard drowning. The public adored him. Ray could barely tolerate the person he believed himself to be. Every tour, every interview, every album cycle was lived with that ghost standing behind him, whispering reminders of a hot Florida afternoon in 1948 that never let him go. It didn't matter how many Grammys he collected or how many generations named him as an influence. Fame stretched his shadow across the globe, but guilt kept him small inside his own skin. By the time he reached his 70s, the dynamic had reversed. The legend was towering, but the man inside that legend felt crushed. The guilt had become the giant in the room. His family later said that every real confession Ray ever made, every whispered fragment, every trembling admission in private, tended to orbit the same unspoken center. No matter how the story started, it always circled back to the same core: cold water, a small body, a final breath. Even in the good years, the sober years, the years when he seemed to have conquered